The whole thing began with lousy real estate loans in the United States, but of course it evolved from there.
Individuals had overborrowed, which got the banks into trouble. The banks were bailed out by countries.
So we have the financial crisis in the United States, we have the collapse of Lehman, and what does that do to the world? It causes all sorts of strictures in capital movement.
One of the things we learned in the fall of 2008 is that financial viruses are extremely contagious.
So when the first germs of the crisis started spreading from the United States to the other countries in around 2008, I was talking to people back in Europe and they were quite optimistic. They felt that the crisis was a crisis predominantly made in the US, which would have had an impact on the rest of the world, but not really undermine the foundations of their economic projects. And of course they were spectacularly wrong.
And there's nothing that happened in subprime mortgages in the United States that can explain why Greece was able to get into the Eurozone, essentially lying about its finances, and why that chicken finally came home to roost.
In October 2009, a rude surprise from Greece. A budget deficit predicted to be around 3% of GDP was actually 12%. Foreign investors who had been buying Greece's debt panicked. By early 2010, they had started to charge more and more to lend to Greece.
And so the first sort of shock, if you like, to the euro system was the knowledge that Greece actually was borrowing far more than people had thought.
I thought that the Europeans were smart enough to know that this was not something that should be allowed to fester. And I was a little surprised that they were unable to move more quickly to, as the saying goes, put a firewall around Greece.
And that frankly speaks to a structural flaw in the EU. It is very, very slow in making decisions because there's so many governments that have to have their say. And therefore, the Greece problem, which could have been tackled easily and resolved, was never resolved.
This first phase of the crisis was, will Greece be able to repay its debt? Will it need help? And that sort of led up to the first bailout of the crisis in Greece in May 2010.
Greece got a bailout and Europe had built itself a rescue fund. But because of the way the Eurozone was designed, the contagion was hellishly difficult to control.
Fresh concerns about Greece are weighing on markets worldwide this morning.
As the investors rethink this and wonder, you know, this is a brewing crisis. How's this going to get fixed? Who's going to pick up the tab for Greece? Are they going to be able to pay back their debts? I've got all of their bonds. Should I be worried, actually, about holding the sovereign debt of Greece? Can I count on Germany? Can I count on the ECB to come to their rescue and pay me off? I don't think so.
Fearing inflation and restricted by its mandate, the European Central Bank stepped in only tepidly and reluctantly. Europe put Greece on an extreme diet of austerity and hoped for the best.
Through the course of 2010, progressively sort of more questions were being asked, and this was being reflected in the increases of borrowing costs for some other countries. There was a real worry that Spain would be following the Greeks, and there were also worries about Portugal. I guess the next phase of the crisis really intensified when it became apparent that Ireland's housing boom had turned to bust.
People thought, well, Greece is the problem, and as long as we insulate it, we're fine. And it suddenly said, oh, well, actually, this can move to Ireland, this can move to Portugal, Spain, Italy, because suddenly any country with bad debt dynamics, we have to think that that's a possible loss. So we have to be very careful about buying those bonds.
By the time Greece and then Spain and Portugal were also in trouble, there were questions starting to arise about Italy. It is a much bigger country, has the third largest bond market in the world.
The first time that the European debt crisis washed up on Italy's shores was in November 2010. That was the first time when we really saw the spreads between Italian bonds and their German equivalent soar.
There were a lot of meetings in 2010, a lot of summits that were supposed to solve the issue. There were a lot of rescue plans announced, but unfortunately none of it was acted decisively so that the markets could finally put their fears to rest.
There was a key moment in 2010 that if you talk to senior officials around Europe now, that they see as being one of the biggest mistakes in the handling of this crisis. And that was the agreement made between the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Nicolas Sarkozy on the boardwalk of the French resort of Deauville in October 2010.
As they were discussing solutions to the European debt crisis, they raised for the first time the idea of what then became called private sector involvement.
This is a sort of euphemism for bondholder losses.
Markets had always believed in one fundamental point, that a European country would not let one of its partners default.
What it did do was to make a whole new host of investors in government bond markets scared of investing. Once they let the genie out of the bottle, they couldn't stuff it back in, and the genie's out of the bottle now.